In a quiet neighborhood, where nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen, a single phone call shattered the calm. What began as an ordinary morning, a familiar rhythm of routine, would soon unravel into something far more unexpected. Behind the doors of a modest home, two lives were intertwined by blood, duty, and years of shared history. But in a matter of minutes, everything changed. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and familiarity, became the center of an unimaginable incident. Smoke curled from a forgotten pan, the scent of something charred still heavy in the air. An overturned chair lay abandoned in the middle of the room. Somewhere in the haze of it all, a decision had been made. One that no one could take back. Outside, the wail of distant sirens grew louder, cutting through the stillness of the morning. Police officers moved swiftly through the scene, their footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. Yet, as they pieced together the fragments of what had happened, a far more complex picture began to emerge, one that stretched beyond a simple act of impulse. For those who knew them, the relationship between the grandmother and her granddaughter seemed unremarkable. They shared a quiet life, predictable, routine, nothing out of the ordinary. But those closest to them never saw the subtle shifts beneath the surface. Small tensions that had grown over time, invisible to outsiders but impossible to ignore within the walls of their home. What would drive someone trusted, familiar, to take such a step? Was it the weight of unspoken frustration? A sudden break in composure? Or did the truth lie in something much deeper? Something rooted in fear, belief, and a fragile sense of control? The answers wouldn't come easily, but as investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover details that suggested the events of that morning were only part of a much larger story. There were signs, some subtle, others impossible to overlook, scattered throughout their shared lives. Clues that, in hindsight, hinted at what was to come. Over the next hour, the story will unfold piece by piece. The moments leading up to that fateful morning. The tangled dynamic between two people bound by family, yet separated by an invisible distance. And the haunting question that lingers, was this the result of a momentary lapse, or something that had been building for much longer? One thing is certain, what happened in that kitchen was no accident. But the truth behind why it happened is far more complicated. To understand how everything led to that fateful morning, you must first understand the people involved. From the outside, their lives seemed unremarkable, ordinary even, but like many stories, the truth becomes far more complicated when you begin to look closer. The grandmother was a woman of routine. Her days followed a strict pattern. Early mornings spent preparing meals, afternoons in quiet reflection. For years, she had taken on the responsibility of raising her granddaughter. It wasn't the life she expected, but she carried the burden with quiet resolve. Friends and neighbors described her as private, distant perhaps, but reliable. Beneath her calm exterior, however, was something else entirely, a need for control, a belief that order was the only thing keeping the chaos at bay. For the granddaughter, life under her grandmother's care was all she had known. She was young, on the edge of adulthood, eager to shape a future of her own. But within the walls of that small home, freedom felt just out of reach. The rules were clear, the expectations even clearer. There was little room for mistakes, and when they happened, they were rarely forgiven. Yet, like any relationship, things hadn't always been tense. There were moments of warmth, small glimpses of a shared bond, meals cooked together in the kitchen, laughter echoing through the house on quiet afternoons. But as time passed, those moments became rare. Something had shifted between them, something no one outside their home could fully understand. Those closest to the family began to notice subtle signs. Conversations grew shorter. The granddaughter became quieter, distracted. There were whispers of arguments, small at first but more frequent. What started as gentle correction gradually became something else entirely. Some wondered if the weight of raising a teenager had simply become too much. Others saw a different side, a controlling nature that had grown more rigid with time. The granddaughter, however, wasn't without her own frustrations. Like many her age, she longed for independence. The outside world promised freedom, a future beyond the walls of her grandmother's home. But every step toward that freedom seemed to bring more tension. It wasn't just the usual struggles between generations. Something deeper seemed to be pulling them apart. As weeks turned to months, those around them sensed the distance growing. But no one, not family, not friends, could have predicted how quickly things would escalate. And by the time the warning signs became clear, it was already too late. Within the walls of that modest home, a fragile balance had been teetering on the edge. And on that particular morning, it finally tipped. What followed would leave a community stunned and a family shattered. But the most unsettling question still remained. Was this the result of years of silent tension? Or was there something else? Something far more unsettling, that no one had ever noticed? The answer may lie in the events of that morning. Events that would unravel everything they thought they knew. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that comes before the day fully begins. In the kitchen, the grandmother stood at the stove, her hands moving with familiar precision. The clinking of a knife against the wooden cutting board echoed softly as she chopped vegetables. The sound of oil heating in the pan crackled, filling the air with the warm scent of breakfast. This was her ritual. Early mornings spent alone in the kitchen, keeping order in a world that often felt unpredictable. For her, breakfast wasn't just a meal. It was a symbol of control. Every movement was deliberate, measured, a way to start the day exactly how it should be. As she worked, her lips moved in a quiet murmur, a prayer spoken in soft, steady tones, a routine as old as her memories, one she rarely missed. It gave her comfort, but that morning something felt off. The air seemed heavier. A faint, nagging unease lingered beneath the surface. The granddaughter entered the kitchen, her steps slow and careless. Her hair was messy, her face marked with tiredness. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement. She moved past the grandmother without a glance, her body language cold and distant. The grandmother watched her closely, too closely. There was tension between them, unspoken but always there. It had been growing for months. Small disagreements, quiet resentment, little things that once seemed harmless now carried weight. And this morning, something about her granddaughter's attitude felt like a challenge. The girl reached for the stove, brushing against the pan with an impatient hand. The grandmother's eyes narrowed, her grip on the knife tightening slightly. In a home where control was everything, small acts of carelessness were not easily forgiven. A heavy silence filled the space between them. The distant tick of the kitchen clock grew louder with every passing second. Neither of them spoke, but something was already building. Slowly, quietly, just beneath the surface. The granddaughter flipped the eggs too quickly. The hot oil hissed and spat as it splattered against the burner. In her rush, she turned the flame too high, causing smoke to rise from the pan. It was a small mistake, but here mistakes did not go unnoticed. The grandmother's expression hardened. Her lips pressed into a thin line as the smoke curled toward the ceiling. She stepped forward, her voice low and cold. The air in the kitchen shifted. What should have been a simple correction became something else, something darker. There was no warmth in her tone, no patience, only the sharp edge of suspicion. The granddaughter tensed. Her shoulders stiffened as she let the spatula drop against the counter with a loud clang. Her face twisted with frustration, but she said nothing. She had grown used to these moments, moments where nothing she did was ever right. But today it felt different, heavier, more dangerous. The smell of burnt food hung thick in the air. The tension between them tightened like a rope pulled too far. Every glance, every breath, every sound seemed to stretch time, making every second feel longer than the last. And then something broke. The grandmother's voice cut through the air again, sharper this time. There was no hesitation, no doubt, just cold certainty as she spoke words that could never be taken back. The granddaughter froze. For a moment the kitchen was silent, too silent. But beneath that silence, something was shifting, something neither of them could stop. What happened next would never fully make sense to anyone who tried to understand it. The sound of movement filled the kitchen, quick, unsteady footsteps across the floor. There was the scrape of something heavy against the counter. Breathing grew louder, uneven, ragged, filled with something too fierce to contain. A single, sharp cry pierced the air, but it didn't last long. And then silence. The kitchen, once full of noise and life, fell still. The clock on the wall ticked on, steady and indifferent. In that quiet, time seemed to stop. Whatever had been set in motion was now impossible to undo. When the first responders arrived, the air inside the home was heavy, too still, too quiet. But nothing could have prepared them for what they would find. What began as an ordinary morning had ended in a way no one could have ever imagined. And for those left behind, the questions would only grow deeper, questions that no simple answer could ever satisfy. The truth of what happened in that kitchen was now a part of their story. But the reasons behind it, those would remain far harder to uncover. The house was quiet when the officers arrived. Too quiet. Outside, their footsteps crunched against the gravel as they moved toward the front door. The air felt heavy, a stillness that often followed something no one wanted to find. Inside, the smell of burnt food lingered, mixing with something far more unsettling. The kitchen lights flickered softly, casting long shadows against the walls. At the center of the room stood the grandmother. Her face was calm, too calm. In her hand, she held the knife. There was no panic in her expression, no sign of fear, just a cold, steady look that didn't change. Even when the officers stepped closer, she did not resist. Her hands, wrinkled and thin, trembled slightly as she lowered the knife onto the kitchen counter. There were no tears, no pleading, only silence. When they asked why she did it, her answer was quick, unshaken, certain. Her voice was quiet but firm. There was no hint of regret, no second-guessing. To her, the truth was simple. In her mind, there was no other choice. The officers moved carefully, following their training. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Still, her face remained blank, a mask that revealed nothing. As they led her out of the house, the sound of distant voices crackled over their radios. Yet, inside that home, time felt frozen. The echo of what had happened would not fade easily. Outside, the flashing lights of patrol cars bathed the street in red and blue. Neighbors stood in clusters, their faces pale with confusion. Whispers spread through the crowd, but no one spoke the words they were all thinking. Some stared at the grandmother as she was led to the police car. Others turned away, unwilling to believe what their eyes had seen. But one fact was clear. Something irreversible had happened behind those closed doors, and the search for answers was only beginning. Inside the station, the investigation began immediately. Detectives pored over every detail, searching for answers. The crime scene itself told a strange story. Too clean, too precise. Nothing was broken. There were no signs of struggle. Everything about that kitchen suggested calm, not chaos. Interviews with family and friends painted a picture of a household that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. The granddaughter was quiet, polite, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The grandmother, though strict, had always seemed responsible. But when detectives looked deeper, a different picture began to emerge. Hidden beneath the surface was a pattern of growing tension. Small arguments that grew more frequent, a relationship strained by control and fear, and something else, something harder to explain. Several people described the grandmother's increasing fixation on things that couldn't be seen. In recent months, her behavior had changed. She spoke of unseen forces, darkness creeping into the home. She had begun to believe there was something wrong with her granddaughter, something beyond simple disobedience. These weren't just passing thoughts. To her, they were real, and as time passed, those beliefs became an obsession. Detectives uncovered receipts from visits to spiritual healers, quiet trips she had taken alone. She had sought answers outside of medicine or logic. Friends recalled her speaking of strange dreams. Warnings, she called them. In her mind, her granddaughter was no longer the child she had raised. Something else had taken hold. And in the weeks leading up to that morning, her fear grew stronger. The question now facing investigators was chilling. Had this act been a sudden burst of anger, Or had it been something else? A decision fueled by a belief that something dangerous lived inside her own family? Reports were compiled. Interviews were recorded. But no amount of paperwork could explain the full truth of what happened in that house. News of the incident spread quickly through the town. In a place where everyone thought they knew each other, no one could understand how something like this had happened. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Many had known the grandmother for years, seen her at the market, passed her during morning walks. She had always seemed quiet, private, a woman who kept to herself but never caused trouble. Some refused to believe it. How could someone so familiar do something so unthinkable? Others remembered signs they had ignored, small hints of something not quite right. A neighbor recalled seeing the grandmother alone at odd hours, whispering under her breath. Another mentioned the time she had warned them about spirits in the neighborhood. Most had brushed it off as harmless talk. Now they weren't so sure. At community meetings, people gathered to share their confusion and fear. What unsettled them most was the lack of clear answers. Was this an isolated act, or the result of something that had been building for years? And if it could happen here, in a quiet home on a quiet street, could it happen again? Within the walls of that house, 2 lives had been forever changed. But outside, the questions were only beginning. People wanted answers. But some truths are harder to face than others. And for those who had known the family, the hardest truth of all was realizing how little they really understood. The trial began on a cold morning. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Reporters filled the benches, their pens ready to capture every word. Family members sat in rigid silence, their faces pale with the weight of what had brought them there. At the center of it all sat the grandmother. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her expression blank. No tears, no signs of regret. If she felt anything, she did not show it. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture. They described a woman who had crossed an unforgivable line, a deliberate act that could not be explained away. The burned breakfast, they argued, was only a spark. What followed was the result of something far deeper, a mind consumed by fear and suspicion. Every detail was laid bare, every moment leading up to that morning examined under harsh light. Defense attorneys told a different story. They described an elderly woman trapped by her own mind, a mind clouded by beliefs that blurred the line between reality and imagination. Experts were called to the stand. Some spoke of mental illness. They explained how paranoia can twist ordinary moments into something threatening. Others focused on culture, describing how deeply rooted fears can shape a person's reality. One psychologist described the grandmother's belief in unseen forces as more than simple superstition. To her, these forces were real, and once that belief took hold, nothing could shake it. In her mind, the granddaughter was no longer just a girl. She was something else, something dangerous. And on that morning, those beliefs had taken control. Throughout the testimony, the grandmother remained still. Her face never changed, even as strangers spoke of her most private thoughts. When asked to speak, her words were brief and cold. She did not deny what she had done, but her explanation remained the same. She believed it had to happen. The courtroom grew heavier with every passing day. The question at the heart of the case was simple. Was this an act of cold intent, or the tragic result of a mind slipping beyond reason? Both sides argued fiercely, but some questions are not so easily answered. When the jury returned, the room fell into a tense silence. The grandmother stood, her back straight, her face as unreadable as ever. Every eye in the courtroom was on her, waiting to hear what justice would decide. The verdict was clear. Guilty, but with conditions. The court recognized the crime but also acknowledged that something within her mind had broken. She would not face a standard prison sentence. Instead, she was declared mentally unfit for regular punishment and was ordered to be placed in a secured psychiatric facility. Some in the family welcomed the decision, believing that compassion was the right path. They argued that the system had failed to notice the signs, warning signals that, if addressed earlier, might have stopped everything before it began. Others were not satisfied. For them, no explanation could erase the reality of what had been taken away. They wanted more answers, more accountability. But justice had spoken, leaving them divided. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager to capture reactions. Some called it a failure of the mental health system, a warning that unspoken fears can grow into something uncontrollable. Others saw it as a sign of something far older, how certain beliefs, left unchecked, can twist even the strongest bonds into something unrecognizable. But no ruling, no expert opinion, could change the final truth. A life had been lost, and nothing would ever restore what had been broken. Long after the trial ended, questions remained. Friends and neighbors still struggled to understand how it had come to this. How did a relationship built on love turn into something so unrecognizable? Was the grandmother truly lost to her beliefs, or had something else, something no one could fully explain, taken hold? Family members recalled strange moments from the months before the tragedy. Whispers of voices only she could hear. Sudden outbursts over things no one else could see. She had once spoken of shadows that followed her through the house. Most thought it was just the ramblings of an aging mind. Now, those words felt different, like a warning no one had understood in time. One moment from her final interview with detectives still haunts those who heard it. When asked if she regretted her actions, the grandmother paused for a long time. Her face, usually so still, shifted into something unreadable. And in a voice that seemed far away, she said something no one expected. "It wasn't my hand holding the knife." Those words hung in the air long after she was led away. Some dismissed them as the delusions of a broken mind. Others weren't so sure. And for those closest to the case, the most unsettling question remains unanswered. What if she truly believed she was telling the truth? The case may be closed, but the questions it leaves behind are not so easy to answer. For those who knew the family, the hardest truth is realizing how little they understood. What seemed like a quiet home, a place of warmth and familiarity, was hiding something far more complicated. Some wonder if the signs were always there, hidden beneath the surface. Were the grandmother's strange beliefs brushed aside for too long? Could someone, anyone, have stepped in before it was too late? Or was this a tragedy no one could have seen coming? The story also raises a deeper, more troubling question. How well do people really know the ones closest to them? Behind closed doors, private thoughts and quiet fears can take root. What happens when those fears grow beyond control? And when belief becomes stronger than reality, how far can it push a person? The answers may never be fully known. What remains is a broken family, a community left with confusion, and a chilling reminder that the most unimaginable acts often begin in the most ordinary places. Stories like this one are rare, but they leave a lasting mark. Some see them as warnings. Others see them as mysteries without clear answers. But everyone has an opinion. What do you think? Was this an act of belief pushed too far, or the result of a mind unraveling in silence? Could something have been done to stop it before that morning changed everything? Share your thoughts below. Your voice matters in understanding cases like these. And this is not the only time family bonds have turned into something deadly. Coming next, another case where trust shattered, and the truth was darker than anyone imagined. Stay tuned. The next story is one you won't forget.